Have you ever gone out for what you thought would be a simple, relaxing morning, only to realize within minutes that everything was about to go completely wrong? That's exactly what happened to me. I went out with my sister, her friend, and her friend's brother, expecting laughs and casual conversation. But in less than 5 minutes, the air turned icy, the smiles vanished, and my sister, she flipped me off in front of everyone. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be just another ordinary morning. It was a Saturday morning that promised little more than lazy chatter, the aroma of coffee, and the clinking of breakfast dishes. The sunlight filtered gently through the blinds, casting long, soft shadows across the kitchen before we even left the house. I slipped into the passenger seat of my sister's car, expecting a casual morning out, nothing extraordinary. Just a chance to step away from the monotony of routine life. My sister, as usual, had already been immersed in a conversation on her phone. The way she spoke fast, precise, commanding made it clear she approached even a casual breakfast with the intensity of someone running a project. There was an energy about her that filled the space without effort, the kind that could lift the room or suffocate it if unchecked. I knew it well, but for some reason, I always hoped this time it might just be relaxed. Joining us were her friend, a petite, lively woman with bright eyes that flicked constantly between curiosity and observation, and her friend's brother, tall, lanky, with an easy grin that never quite reached his eyes. The four of us together felt like characters on a stage, each playing our part, my sister directing, her friend observing, her brother calculating, and me trying not to trip over invisible lines of expectation. The restaurant was a familiar chain, the kind Americans rely on for its predictability. Warm lights bounced off polished wood, the smell of fried potatoes mingling with freshly brewed coffee. People moved in the background, a soft hum of life threading through the air, providing a comforting, mundane backdrop. And yet, I felt like a careful observer, noticing the subtle rhythms of the space, the waitress adjusting her ponytail, the man at the corner table nervously scrolling on his phone, the sound of fries sizzling somewhere just beyond the kitchen wall. We were seated near a large window. Sunlight caught my sister's hair, making it shimmer, drawing my eyes despite myself. She immediately launched into her week's stories, gestures large, laughter frequent, voice rising and falling like a well-rehearsed performance. Her friend listened intently, occasionally nodding and smiling, while her brother leaned back slightly, arms crossed, as if keeping a mental tally of every word. I sipped my coffee slowly, trying to blend in, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. For a moment, everything felt normal, almost idyllic. I watched my sister's friend glance at me every so often, a questioning look as though she was assessing my place in the conversation. Her brother's scrutinizing gaze flicked briefly in my direction, subtle but unmistakable. I laughed at one of my sister's exaggerated stories, tried to keep the mood light, letting her energy dominate the space, and then it happened. She mentioned, almost casually, that she wanted fries. Simple enough, right? But the tone she used, eyes locking on mine, a small, expectant smile implied, "Go get them for me." I paused. The familiar pattern of being expected to comply rose inside me, the unspoken rules of sibling hierarchy settling over the table like a shadow. I decided to diffuse it with humor. "Why don't you liberate yourself and grab them?" I said, trying to make it sound like a joke. But humor didn't land. Her eyes flicked sharply, the small smile vanishing. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Her friend looked between us, eyebrows slightly raised in silent curiosity, while her brother leaned forward, the faintest frown tugging at his lips. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the hum of the restaurant fading into the background. I realized in that suspended second this was the crack in the morning's calm, the first real indication that things were about to get complicated. I remember thinking, this is one of those mornings. The moment I suggested she get the fries herself, the atmosphere shifted like a sudden drop in temperature. I could almost feel the invisible line of tension stretching across the table. My sister's eyes narrowed, not dramatically, but just enough for me to notice the subtle tightening around her jaw and the tiny flare of her nostrils. Those were the first signs, the subtle signals I had learned to read over the years, warning that she was starting to feel challenged. Her friend, perched on the edge of her chair, tilted her head slightly, glancing back and forth between us. Her expression was polite, almost neutral, but I could sense the flicker of curiosity and mild surprise. Was this normal sibling banter? Or had I just inadvertently crossed some unspoken boundary? Her brother, on the other hand, leaned forward a little, arms still crossed, brow furrowed. His body language screamed caution, like he was bracing for impact, ready to witness a potential blow-up but not intervening yet. "I'm serious," my sister said, voice sharp but controlled. The words clipped like she was measuring them carefully. "I want you to get them." I swallowed the instinct to sigh and replied lightly, trying to keep my tone teasing yet firm. "Why? You're perfectly capable of getting them yourself. Besides, you'd probably enjoy stretching your legs a little." Her hand shot out toward the table, tapping twice, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, but the intensity behind it was palpable. It was a warning, an unspoken "I'm not kidding." I glanced at her friend, who now sat a little straighter, and then at her brother, who didn't say anything but raised an eyebrow as though silently judging my audacity. The table fell into an awkward silence. I could hear the low hum of the restaurant around us, the faint clatter of dishes in the distance, but it all seemed to fade behind the tension stretching from my sister to me. I realized then that the morning, which had started with laughter and casual conversation, was beginning to fracture. I took a sip of coffee, trying to calm the fluttering in my chest. I reminded myself this was just fries. Literally, nothing more than fries. And yet, it wasn't about the fries. It was always more than the fries. It was about control, expectation, and the invisible hierarchy she wielded like a weapon. "I'm not your servant," I said quietly, leaning back in my chair, letting the words hang in the air. Her eyes widened slightly, just a fraction, and I could see the flush rising in her cheeks. Her friend's mouth opened, then closed, as though she wanted to say something but wasn't sure whether she should. Her brother leaned back again, exhaling slowly, the tension radiating off him in faint waves. For a moment, none of us spoke. I watched my sister's fingers drum lightly on the table, each tap deliberate, rhythmic, a silent punctuation to the brewing storm. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on me now, not accusing exactly, but evaluating. Like a jury assembling without a trial, their silence was its own kind of judgment. Finally, my sister muttered something under her breath, so quiet I wasn't sure I heard it correctly, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a blend of irritation and disbelief, a whisper that seemed to echo louder than words. "You think I can do this myself?" I gave her a calm smile, the kind that came from practice over years of navigating these battles. "Of course you can. I'm just suggesting it might be fun," I said. Her friend shifted again, subtly, leaning slightly toward her brother, maybe seeking solidarity or just an ally. I caught the flash of her eyes on mine, a look I recognized immediately. "What is happening right now?" And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the dynamics of this morning were no longer simple or predictable. The next few minutes passed in a series of small, silent exchanges, glances, slight nods, a tightening of shoulders here, a tiny smirk there. Every gesture felt amplified, loaded with meaning. I noticed my sister's foot tapping under the table, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the napkin, subtle signs of mounting frustration. I kept my body relaxed, sipping my coffee deliberately, trying to anchor myself amidst the subtle chaos. I even caught myself imagining scenarios, almost like a mental rehearsal. If I get the fries, she wins. If I refuse, the room freezes. If I joke, it might escalate. If I stay silent, the calculus of family dynamics, as always, was brutal in its precision. Her friend finally spoke, lightly, trying to bridge the gap. "Maybe we can all just go look around?" Her tone was gentle, cautious, clearly designed to avoid picking sides. Her brother didn't say anything but gave a faint shrug, his eyes flicking between us, reading the tension like a map of fault lines. My sister's expression hardened. "No, I want her to get it," she said, pointing in my direction, more assertive now. The tap-tap of her fingers became a little faster, almost impatient. And that's when I realized the morning was no longer just about a snack. It had become a test of boundaries, patience, and composure. I leaned back, letting the tension settle over me. I thought about speaking again, trying to inject some humor or diffuse the situation, but the words felt brittle, inadequate. I caught her friend's slight eye roll, just a blink, just enough to tell me she was uncomfortable. And then her brother's faint sigh, a quiet exhale that said he was aware of the absurdity but didn't want to intervene. It was one of those rare, suspended moments where you feel completely aware of every micro gesture, every subtle tone, every tiny fluctuation in the room's energy. And I realized, almost with a thrill of anxious anticipation, that the calm of the morning was gone. That invisible line had been crossed, and the day had officially shifted. The moment was suspended, taut, like a string about to snap. I had expected tension, sure, but nothing prepared me for the sharp, almost physical twist of reality that hit when my sister suddenly, deliberately, lifted her hand. One finger extended, pointed at me across the table, a gesture so raw, so unfiltered, it carved the air between us. Her friend gasped softly, a sound that barely escaped her lips, but it was enough. The suddenness of it made everyone flinch, including me. The restaurant's background hummed the clatter of dishes. Low murmur of other patrons faded into nothing. All that remained was her gaze, sharp and unyielding, and that single, undeniable gesture. I froze. For a heartbeat, I couldn't decide whether to laugh, apologize, or explode. My mind raced, a chaotic loop of questions. Why? How? Why now? I knew my sister had a temper, a tendency to escalate, but to do this in public, in front of her friend, in front of her brother, it was surreal. Her friend shifted in her seat, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Her eyes darted between us like a lifeguard scanning for drowning swimmers. Her brother leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped jaw tight. I could see the tiny tremor of frustration in him, the subtle twitch of his lips, the kind of barely there signs that scream, I'm trying not to judge, but I can't ignore this. I took a breath, slow, deliberate, trying to steady the internal whirlwind that was now threatening to spill out. Humor was useless here, logic pointless. There was only the raw, tense electricity crackling in the air, making it impossible to move without seeming reactive. I don't know what you want me to say, I murmured finally, my voice low, trying to remain calm. If you want the fries, get them yourself. I'm not doing it. Her eyes narrowed further, if that was even possible. The flush in her cheeks deepened, the kind that only comes when frustration meets pride. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The gesture, the stare, the silence, it said it all. Her friend's eyes flicked to me, then back to my sister, silently pleading, please, don't make this worse. Her brother's gaze never left us, calculating, judging, observing. There was a weight to their silence, a kind of collective pressure that made my chest tighten. I was suddenly painfully aware of every movement I made, the tap of my fingers against the table, the way I crossed my legs, the small shifting of my shoulders. Time slowed. 15 minutes stretched into an eternity. Every second was punctuated by micro-expressions, subtle gestures, and the growing tension that made the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. I tried to speak, to crack a joke, to lighten the room, but my words felt brittle. Bouncing off an invisible wall of judgment, I caught a tiny glance from her friend's sympathy. Perhaps, or maybe embarrassment, but her lips remained sealed. Her brother's jaw clenched, a slight exhale as if the effort of restraint was physically taxing. My sister's finger remained pointed, unwavering, a silent declaration of dominance. I thought about how strange it was, how quickly a normal morning could dissolve into a stage of silent war. People around us continued their routines, oblivious to the tension, while I sat trapped in a spotlight of expectation and judgment. Every movement, every breath was amplified. I noticed the way her fingers seemed to assert ownership over the space, a surreal physical manifestation of control. I leaned back slightly, trying to breathe, to regain some sense of control. I reminded myself silently, it's not about the fries. It's never about the fries. It's about power, about boundaries, about a sibling's unspoken rule book I was always expected to follow. I finally spoke again, cautiously, trying to extend an olive branch. I can even pay for them if that's what you want. A small attempt to redirect the tension into practicality. Her reaction was nothing. She didn't speak, didn't look away. The fingers stayed raised, the stare unbroken. Her friend's eyes widened, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Her brother shifted slightly, the faintest shake of his head a subtle acknowledgement of absurdity that he was too polite to voice aloud. And then it hit me, the silence itself had become a weapon. Every glance, every moment of inaction, every unspoken judgment, pressed down on me, heavier than words could ever be. I realized painfully that this morning was no longer about breakfast. It was a battlefield, and I had just entered the first skirmish. I sipped my coffee slowly, deliberately, as if drawing strength from the warmth of the cup. I needed an anchor. I watched my sister tap her finger once more on the table. Each tap a punctuation mark to the tension. Each tap a reminder that this was her world and I was navigating it at my own risk. Her friend finally leaned slightly toward her brother. A silent, almost imperceptible gesture of alliance. The room felt smaller, the stakes higher. I felt like I had become a character in someone else's story, expected to perform, expected to submit, expected to fail if I didn't comply, and I thought, this is it. This is what it always feels like. A calm morning can turn into a storm in seconds, and there's nothing you can do to stop it once the line is crossed. The silence lingered, heavy and unbroken, even after the initial shock of her gesture had passed. It stretched across the table like a tangible weight, pressing down on everyone. I realized then that sometimes the absence of words can scream louder than any argument. Her friend avoided my gaze, eyes darting between her sister and me, clearly uncomfortable. Her brother sat back in his chair, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, silently processing the absurdity without comment. I watched my sister fidget slightly, a subtle shift of her foot under the table, a twitch of her fingers. It was clear she was trying to regain control of the morning, to assert that this was her world and we were all just players in it. But the tension that had been released in that small gesture, the finger, the stare, the silence hung thickly in the air. Impossible to ignore. "I'm going to get the pastries," she said finally, her tone clipped but deliberate. She stood, moving toward the counter without another word, leaving a palpable void behind her. The motion was mundane, almost casual. But in the context of what had just transpired, it felt like a retreat from battle. A grudging acknowledgement that even she couldn't push any further without consequences. Her friend and her brother both remained seated, exchanging brief, subtle glances. Neither spoke, perhaps unsure if their intervention would help or worsen things. I realized that everyone had become an observer, unwilling participants in a tension that had spiraled beyond casual breakfast chatter. I tried to break the silence, offering small comments about the menu, casual observations about the morning. My words floated into the air, ignored, unheard. It was as if a barrier had been erected, invisible, but impervious. Every laugh, every attempt at normal conversation fell flat. When my sister returned with the pastries, the air shifted slightly again, but not toward ease. She placed the bag on the table with a sharp exhale, eyes briefly meeting mine. "It's your fault we're all here," she muttered, almost under her breath but loud enough for me to hear. The words struck harder than any gesture, heavier than the finger. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer explanation or apology, just the statement, cold and absolute. I felt the mix of frustration, disbelief, and a quiet resolve settle in me. I wanted to respond, to argue, to defend myself, but something told me it was pointless. The morning, for all its promise of casual fun, had ended. The intended relaxation was gone, replaced by a lingering tension that none of us could shake immediately. Her friend and her brother didn't linger. They gathered their belongings, gave polite nods, and left the table with the quiet efficiency of people who had seen too much but knew there was nothing to do. I watched them go, feeling a combination of relief and exhaustion. The space they left behind was still thick with unspoken words. With the weight of what had occurred, I sat there for a moment longer, sipping my coffee, thinking about how a simple request, just fries, just pastries, had escalated into a silent standoff, a complex dance of control, pride, and expectation. I thought about the invisible rules that my sister had always operated under, the way family dynamics could shift an ordinary morning into something almost theatrical in intensity, and then quietly, I accepted it. The morning was over. We had attempted to enjoy ourselves, and yet, the calm had been irreversibly broken. I finished my coffee, gathering my things slowly, deliberately, as though the act itself would help me reclaim some small piece of composure. As we left the restaurant, the morning sun shining down in the usual warmth, I realized something important. Sometimes family isn't about comfort or laughter. Sometimes it's about boundaries, resilience, and navigating unpredictable storms with your own sense of self intact. And as my sister's words echoed faintly behind me, "It's your fault we're all here," I understood, with a mixture of exasperation and quiet clarity, that this was not just a morning gone wrong. It was a lesson in patience, in observation, and in recognizing that some conflicts, no matter how small they seem, carry the weight of much more than their immediate cause. I glanced at her one last time, a mixture of resignation and resolve in my gaze, and silently promised myself, I would not be broken by a morning, by a gesture, or by anyone else's expectations. This was my boundary, and it was mine to hold. The car ride home, or rather, the short drive to the next destination, was quiet. Not the comfortable silence of people lost in thought or enjoying each other's company, but the thick, suffocating kind that seemed to fill every corner of the space. My sister sat behind the wheel, tapping the steering wheel lightly, jaw tight, eyes forward, completely ignoring me. I could feel the invisible wall between us. Heavier than the steel of the car doors, her friend sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing out the window, as if the passing scenery might somehow distract her from the tension radiating from the front seat. Her brother leaned slightly back, arms crossed, eyes forward but darting occasionally to measure the distance between us, calculating, cautious, silent. I watched them all, noting the subtle shifts, the slight frown on her friend's face, the tightening of her brother's jaw, the impatient tapping of my sister's foot. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, maybe even crack a small joke, but each word felt like it might ignite another fire. Instead, I sat quietly observing. I noticed the small details I had learned to read over years of family outings, the way my sister's shoulders rose slightly when frustrated, the way her fingers drummed a rapid rhythm when she was trying to assert control, the fleeting glance her friend gave her brother that seemed to plead for intervention or at least acknowledgement. By the time we reached the next location, a small park near the edge of town, my chest felt heavy. The air outside was crisp, the morning sun warm on my skin, but none of it penetrated the bubble of tension that had formed around us. I stepped out of the car slowly, carefully, aware of every movement, every potential glance. My sister moved ahead, briskly, not looking back. Her friend hesitated for a moment, scanning the area, then followed, her pace slightly slower, unsure. Her brother lagged a step behind, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping the scene, seemingly detached but clearly aware of every interaction. I lingered, feeling the odd mixture of relief and apprehension that came with moving out of the car but still trapped in the morning's unresolved conflict. As we settled on a bench near a small fountain, I tried again to engage. "It's a beautiful morning," I said lightly, attempting to reclaim some normalcy, to carve a little space where conversation could exist. Her friend gave a polite smile but didn't respond, her eyes flicking briefly toward my sister. Her brother nodded faintly, but it was a non-committal gesture, almost perfunctory. My sister, of course, didn't acknowledge me at all. She stared at the fountain, arms crossed, shoulders stiff, a physical barrier erected between us. I realized that this was the aftermath phase, the quiet storm that followed the outburst. It wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, but it was persistent, insidious. The tension lingered like smoke in a room, impossible to ignore, shaping every glance, every movement, every word or lack thereof. I tried to focus on neutral observations, the way the sunlight reflected off the water, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant laughter of children playing nearby. I told myself to anchor in these small, concrete details, to avoid being drawn into the vortex of lingering resentment. Still, my thoughts kept drifting back to that single gesture, the finger, the unspoken words, the silent judgment. I replayed it in my mind again and again, analyzing, dissecting, wondering what I could have done differently. But even as I considered every possible scenario, I knew deep down, nothing I said or did could have prevented the escalation entirely. The dynamics were already in motion. Her sister's friend finally spoke, softly, almost hesitantly. "Maybe we can just enjoy the park for a bit? Get our minds off the breakfast thing?" Her tone was careful, deliberate, like she was diffusing a bomb with words. Her brother gave a slight nod, a silent agreement, while my sister remained unmoved, absorbed in her own thoughts, a slight scowl forming on her forehead. It was clear that she had moved on internally to another level of frustration, unwilling to acknowledge any attempt at mediation. I stayed silent, taking a deep breath. I realized that this was the moment to observe, to learn, to take note of human behavior in its rawest, most unfiltered form. Family dynamics, I thought, were never simple. They were messy, unpredictable, and often painfully illuminating. And yet, in the midst of this awkward, heavy silence, I found a small sense of clarity. The morning had been difficult, tense, and uncomfortable, but it had also reminded me of boundaries, of self-respect, and of the subtle ways people communicate power. Even without words, I watched her friend toss a small pebble into the fountain, her hand trembling slightly as if she too felt the weight of the morning. Her brother adjusted his posture, shoulders back, hands resting lightly on his knees. My sister remained still, unyielding, a portrait of stubbornness and pride. And I sat among them, aware of everything, silently determined not to lose myself in the tension. It was a small, delicate moment of self-preservation, a conscious choice to maintain composure even when the world around me felt absurd and confrontational. And I knew that whatever came next, whatever minor frustrations or subtle escalations would follow, I had learned something valuable: patience, observation, and a clear sense of boundaries could survive even the most unpredictable storms. The park was deceptively peaceful, a facade of calm that hid the simmering tension from breakfast. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the sunlight cast warm patterns across the walking paths. To an outsider, it might have seemed like any ordinary Saturday morning, but for us, it was still a battlefield. My sister walked ahead with her usual brisk pace, arms crossed, jaw tight. I noticed her fingers clenching and unclenching slightly, a subtle indicator of her internal agitation. Her friend and her brother followed, each step deliberate, measured, their bodies' language carefully neutral, as though to avoid further confrontation. I walked behind them, silently observing every gesture, every micro-expression, feeling as though I was navigating a minefield. After a few minutes, my sister stopped near a bench under a large oak tree, turning to look at me with an expression that mixed impatience with expectation. "Come on, we're here to hang out. Don't just stand there," she said, her tone clipped but not overtly angry. I understood immediately she wanted compliance, acknowledgement, proof that I was willing to conform to her plan. I stayed where I was, feeling a familiar surge of resistance. I don't have to do everything for her, I thought. I wanted to assert myself, but carefully, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. "I'm fine here," I said lightly. "You go on. I'll catch up." Her eyes flashed with irritation, the same look I had learned to dread. The corner of her mouth tightened, a small frown forming, and she tilted her head ever so slightly, the kind of gesture that silently demanded, "Do you think you can defy me?" Her friend shifted uneasily, glancing at me. I could see the silent question in her eyes. Are you going to give in, or are you going to escalate this? Her brother's gaze was unreadable, but I felt it weighing on me, measuring me, almost daring me to break. The moment stretched, taut with anticipation. I noticed how my sister's body language had changed since the breakfast incident, the way she leaned slightly forward, the slight tightening around her shoulders, the subtle firmness in her stance. She was testing boundaries, seeing if I would move, if I would comply, if I would yield to her silent command. I took a slow breath, grounding myself. I realized that this wasn't about the park, or the walk, or even the breakfast anymore. This was about control, about dominance, about who set the terms of interaction in our small, insular world. And I was finally willing to stand my ground. "Seriously?" she said again, a touch louder this time, as if raising her voice could reclaim the authority she felt slipping. "Why are you always like this? Can't you just do something for me for once?" I met her gaze evenly. "Because I don't have to. You're perfectly capable of doing it yourself," I said, my tone calm but firm. The words were simple, yet they carried weight, the quiet assertion of my independence, a refusal to be manipulated. The air around us stiffened. I could feel her friend's discomfort, the slight shift of weight, the nervous glance toward her brother. He didn't say anything, but his posture tightened. The subtle exhale he let out spoke volumes. Tension acknowledged, but intervention withheld. For a few moments, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant laughter of children playing, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the faint hum of traffic far away. And in that silence, I felt the absurdity of the situation, how a simple desire for fries, a small gesture, a morning outing, had spiraled into a study of human behavior, control, and family dynamics. Then my sister did something I hadn't expected. She folded her arms, leaned back slightly, and gave a dismissive laugh, sharp, short, almost sarcastic. "Fine," she said. "If you're going to act like a child, I'll just do it myself." She turned on her heel and began walking toward the small snack stand across the park. Her friend and her brother exchanged a quick glance, subtle but telling. They followed, and I trailed behind slowly, feeling the lingering tension pressing against me with every step. The morning had already left its mark. The earlier breakfast incident still lingered like a shadow over the day, coloring every interaction, every glance. When my sister returned with a small bag of snacks, she held it in front of her as if it were a trophy. The movement was deliberate, almost performative. "There," she said, placing the bag on the bench. "Are we happy now?" Her tone was sharp, the question rhetorical, meant to assert control rather than invite discussion. I looked at the bag, then at her friend and her brother. Everyone's eyes flicked briefly to me, waiting for my reaction. I felt the weight of expectation, the silent judgment, but I refused to give it the power to dictate my response. I smiled faintly, calmly. "Thanks," I said simply. No sarcasm, no anger, just acknowledgement. The remainder of the morning passed slowly, filled with tentative conversation, small jokes that felt forced, and careful movements as if we were all navigating a fragile truce. The tension remained, subtle but pervasive, a reminder that boundaries had been tested and none of us had emerged unchanged. I realized that mornings like this weren't about what you did or didn't do, they were about understanding the dynamics, observing the subtle cues, and maintaining your own sense of self in the midst of familial turbulence. And though the day wasn't ruined, it had changed. The calm, casual outing I had hoped for was gone, replaced with lessons about control, resilience, and the quiet strength required to stand your ground without exploding. The park, which had seemed so peaceful moments ago, now felt charged, like the calm before a storm. My sister's insistence on asserting her will created an invisible pressure that stretched across the bench, across the small circle of us, thickening the air around our conversation. Her friend and her brother seemed tense, as though they were balancing on a tightrope, careful not to tip the fragile balance. I tried to make light conversation, commenting on the sunlight reflecting off the fountain, the sound of a distant dog barking, anything neutral to ease the moment. But every word I spoke felt hollow, bounced back by the lingering tension, swallowed by the weight of unspoken expectations. Her gaze caught mine, a subtle shift, a narrowing of her eyes. I felt it immediately, an unspoken challenge. Her finger had been lowered since breakfast, but her authority remained, silent yet undeniable. Every gesture, every word, every glance became a test. Would I give in? Would I flinch? "I don't get it," she said suddenly, voice sharp. "Why can't you just do something for me for once? Is it really that hard?" Her words were calm, almost conversational, but the underlying edge was unmistakable. I met her gaze evenly, holding my ground. "Because you can do it yourself," I said, my voice quiet but firm. There was no anger, no aggression, just a statement of fact. The air shifted again. Her friend looked down, fidgeting with her hands, uncertain how to intervene. Her brother, stoic as ever, let out a faint sigh, shoulders tensing. It was as though the entire space had been compressed, every micro gesture amplified. Then my sister, exasperated, leaned forward slightly, gesturing toward the snacks she had just bought. "Really? You're going to sit there and act like this? Everyone else is trying to enjoy the morning, and you're—" She trailed off, as if words couldn't capture her frustration fully. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to speak, to deflect, to explain, but even in silence, I was aware of the tension, the weight of her judgment, the subtle expectations pressing down on me. I realized, with a quiet resignation, that this wasn't about snacks or a walk in the park. It was about control, about dominance, about testing boundaries, and about seeing if I would yield under scrutiny. I looked around. Her friend was avoiding eye contact, glancing nervously at her brother, who was observing quietly, hands clasped, posture tense. They were witnesses, not participants, observers of a conflict that had escalated beyond words. I took a deep breath, trying to anchor myself. I reminded myself, it's not personal. It's not about winning or losing. It's about maintaining your own sense of self in the midst of someone else's chaos. Her sister's impatience was palpable. She leaned back again, tapping the bench lightly, the sound deliberate, a rhythm that punctuated her frustration. I watched it, noting how even small actions carried weight, how gestures could speak louder than words. Finally, she let out a short laugh, almost sarcastic. "Fine," she said, exhaling sharply. "Do what you want. But don't expect everyone else to be happy about it." Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the invisible rules she was enforcing. The remainder of the park visit continued under a veil of unspoken tension. Conversation was tentative, laughter forced, movements careful. Everyone seemed aware that one wrong glance, one careless comment, could reignite the friction. Even though we were surrounded by the light of a sunny morning and the gentle sounds of nature, the weight of the earlier conflicts remained, shaping our interactions. I observed it all: the subtle glances, the hesitation before speaking, the careful navigation of physical space. Each gesture told a story, each micro-expression revealed underlying emotions. And through it all, I remained aware of my own choices, my own boundaries. I refused to be drawn into unnecessary conflict, refusing to escalate, refusing to yield, simply holding my ground amidst the subtle turbulence. By the time we began to leave the park, the tension hadn't disappeared. It had merely transformed, more subdued, quieter, like a storm passing overhead but leaving the air charged with residual electricity. Everyone carried the unspoken reminders of the morning, the breakfast incident, the finger, the words, all of it lingering invisibly, shaping our walk back to the car. And in that quiet observation, I realized something essential: family dynamics, especially with someone as commanding as my sister, were never straightforward. They were a complex dance of authority, expectation, and subtle power struggles. Understanding them required patience, careful observation, and the strength to maintain one's own sense of self no matter the provocation. By the time we made our way back to the car, the park's gentle warmth had lost its charm. The sunlight, which had seemed inviting just minutes before, now felt intrusive, highlighting every small crease of tension in our expressions. My sister walked ahead, brisk, determined, while her friend and her brother followed in measured, careful steps. I lagged slightly behind, observing, absorbing, reflecting. The ride home was quiet, almost painfully so. Not the quiet of comfortable contemplation, but the thick, heavy silence of unresolved conflict. Every movement in the car, the shifting of a seatbelt, the tapping of fingers on the console, the subtle creak of the brakes seemed amplified in the charged atmosphere. Her friend occasionally stole glances at me, eyes filled with an unspoken apology, or perhaps confusion. Her brother's posture remained rigid, arms crossed, jaw tight, silently acknowledging the absurdity but unwilling to intervene. And my sister, of course, remained immersed in her own world, eyes on the road, a faint frown shadowing her face. I reflected on the morning's series of events: the breakfast, the insistence on fries, the small but devastating gesture of the finger, the lingering tension at the park. It was all so trivial, in theory a few snacks, a casual outing. And yet, it had escalated, revealing layers of control, pride, and unspoken family dynamics that I had navigated countless times before. Her sister finally spoke, breaking the silence, though not directly to me. "I guess we can just grab some pastries and head home," she said, her tone clipped, leaving no room for debate. It was more a statement of fact than a suggestion. We stopped at a small bakery nearby. My sister moved efficiently, selecting a few items and placing them in a small bag. She didn't glance my way, didn't offer a word of acknowledgement beyond the minimal polite interaction with the cashier. Her friend hovered slightly behind, hesitant, while her brother observed quietly, weighing each movement, each decision. When she finally turned to me, placing the bag on the seat between us, she muttered, almost under her breath, "It's your fault we're all here." The words were not meant for discussion, explanation, or reconciliation. They were a final punctuation mark, a crystallization of the morning's tension. I didn't respond. I simply nodded slightly, eyes forward, taking in the statement for what it was: a reflection of her perspective, not a measure of my reality. The ride back was equally silent, punctuated only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional distant sounds of the city waking up around us. I let my thoughts drift, reflecting on what had transpired. The morning had been challenging, awkward, and uncomfortable, yet it had provided insight. I realized that some family dynamics are battles fought in subtle gestures, unspoken words, and silent judgments. The finger, the insistence, the tension, it was all part of a complex language of power and expectation. And surviving it required awareness, patience, and the quiet assertion of one's own boundaries. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The morning had been long, more emotionally taxing than physically, and yet I also felt a quiet pride. I had held my ground, navigated the tension without escalation, and maintained my sense of self amidst the subtle storm. As I stepped out of the car, I glanced back at my sister, at her friend, and her brother. Each carried their own reflections, their own judgments, their own silent narratives. And I understood with clarity that mornings like this, ordinary on the surface but complex beneath, were as much about observation, resilience, and personal boundaries as they were about anything else. I walked into the house, carrying the weight of the morning, but also the insight it had provided. Family, I realized, wasn't always about comfort or harmony. Sometimes it was about recognizing control, asserting independence, and navigating the silent storms that arise when expectations collide. And sometimes the quietest, most unspoken victories, holding your ground, maintaining your composure, are the most meaningful of all. The following weekend, I found myself back in the same rhythm of routine, yet with a sense of anticipation that felt heavier than usual. The memory of the breakfast incident and the park lingered like a faint echo, subtly coloring my expectations for the day. Even mundane activities, driving to a coffee shop, choosing a seat, ordering a drink, carried the weight of the previous tensions. My sister had invited me to join her friend, and her brother for a casual afternoon outing, something she framed as just to hang out. But after the last two encounters, I knew better. Just hanging out was often code for subtle tests of patience, control, and boundaries. As I drove toward the meeting point, I felt a quiet tension in my chest. I reminded myself to stay composed, to observe carefully, and to resist the instinct to anticipate confrontation. The car's interior hummed softly, the sound of tires on asphalt mingling with my own thoughts, each mile reinforcing a sense of careful vigilance. When I arrived, I saw them gathered outside a small cafe, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. My sister's posture was assertive, confident, her hands on her hips as if she owned the space. Her friend stood slightly behind her, a tentative smile playing on her lips, while her brother leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. A quiet observer of the unfolding scene, I stepped out of my car and forced a small smile, a deliberate act of diplomacy. "Hey," I said lightly, "ready for coffee?" My sister glanced at me, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips, but her eyes held that familiar edge, the subtle combination of challenge and expectation. "Of course," she said. "Let's see if you can survive this one." Her friend chuckled softly, a nervous sound, while her brother's eyebrow arched ever so slightly, acknowledging the unspoken tension that already hung between us. I could feel the weight of their gazes, each measuring, assessing, and silently predicting my behavior. We moved toward the cafe, the walk filled with tentative conversation, small comments about the weather, passing pedestrians, and the aroma of fresh coffee. I noticed every gesture, every glance, my sister's quick, purposeful strides, the flick of her hair as she adjusted her sunglasses, the subtle pacing of her friend's steps, the relaxed yet watchful stance of her brother. As we approached the cafe entrance, my sister paused, turning to me with a playful but pointed look. "Remember," she said lightly, "it's just coffee. Don't make it complicated." I smiled, keeping my tone neutral, aware of the layered meaning behind her words. Just coffee was never just coffee. It was a subtle invitation to navigate expectations, to assert composure, to maintain boundaries while engaging socially. Inside the cafe, we ordered our drinks, the barista unaware of the invisible currents swirling among us. I chose a seat slightly removed from my sister, giving myself space to observe, to breathe, to maintain a sense of control. My sister sat across from me, her friend beside her, her brother at an angle that allowed him to watch both of us simultaneously. The arrangement was deliberate, a microcosm of the larger dynamics at play. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth anchor me as I listened to their conversation, light, casual chatter that belied the underlying tension. Every laugh, every shared glance, every subtle shift in posture carried unspoken meaning. I was acutely aware of the invisible scales of judgment, the subtle cues, the small moments that could tip the balance one way or another. And yet, amidst the tension, there was a strange sense of calm within me. I had learned to navigate these moments, to observe without reacting impulsively, to assert my presence without surrendering to manipulation. This afternoon, like the mornings before, was a test not of strength or aggression, but of patience, awareness, and self-possession. As we continued to sit, sip coffee, and exchange carefully measured words, I realized that each encounter, each interaction, was a lesson. A lesson in control, in subtle power dynamics, in understanding how gestures, glances, and words could shape the social terrain. And though the day ahead promised more challenges, more subtle tests, I felt prepared. Not victorious, not triumphant, but grounded, aware, composed, and ready to engage on my own terms. The cafe buzzed with casual activity, the soft clatter of cups and saucers mingling with quiet conversations. But in our small corner, the air was anything but casual. The tension from the past weeks clung to us, invisible, yet heavy, shaping every glance and every gesture. My sister reached across the table, fingers brushing against mine as she grabbed a napkin. The motion was casual in appearance, but I felt the underlying assertion it was hers to claim, hers to control. I pulled my hand back slightly, deliberately, making no sudden movements, just enough to signal that I wasn't going to comply without awareness. Her friend watched us, eyes flicking back and forth, unsure whether to intervene or maintain silence. Her brother leaned back, hands folded, gaze sharp, silently observing the subtle power play unfolding before him. Each of them seemed aware that the room's calm exterior could mask the tension building beneath the surface. "So," my sister said, her voice light, almost teasing, "remember the park? That was interesting." The words carried a subtle edge, a test. Would I react defensively, apologize, explain, or assert myself again? I met her gaze evenly, letting the quiet strength in my posture speak louder than words. "Yeah," I said calmly. "Interesting." Short, neutral, measured. A refusal to engage in escalation but a clear assertion of presence. She narrowed her eyes slightly, a small frown forming. The kind of expression that says, "I expected more from you." I could feel her frustration, like a pressure in the space between us. Her friend shifted, hands clasped together, glancing nervously at her brother as if waiting for guidance or intervention. He remained silent, observing, absorbing, detached yet watchful. Then came the small spark, a casual comment from my sister that seemed innocent to an outsider but charged with layers of meaning. "I guess some people just like to make things difficult," she said, tilting her head slightly, eyes briefly meeting mine. I paused, letting her words hang in the air. They weren't loud, they weren't confrontational, but the intent was clear. I chose not to respond immediately, to allow the statement to exist without fuel from me. The silence that followed was powerful, stretching the tension across the table. Her friend's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. Her brother's jaw tightened slightly, the faintest exhale betraying his internal acknowledgement of the dynamics. I realized that every person at the table was silently negotiating their own position in this microcosm of control and resistance. I sipped my coffee slowly, a deliberate act to ground myself. I reminded myself, this wasn't a battle to be won with words. It was a test of patience, awareness, and composure. My sister might try to provoke, to unsettle, to assert dominance, but I could navigate it without losing myself. Minutes passed in careful conversation, small observations about the cafe, the weather, the people walking outside, every word measured, every gesture calculated. And still, the tension simmered beneath the surface, subtle yet undeniable. At one point, my sister leaned back, smirked slightly, and said, "I hope you're paying attention. It's all very subtle, but I notice everything." Her eyes flicked briefly to her friend and her brother, who both offered small, almost imperceptible nods. The comment wasn't directed only at me, it was an acknowledgement of the unspoken rules, the hierarchy, the invisible currents that shaped our interactions. I took another slow sip, holding my gaze calmly, refusing to react. The silence between us became a conversation of its own, more potent than words. Her gestures, her smirks, her quiet provocations, they all spoke volumes. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. The most intense conflicts often unfold in subtle ways, in small sparks rather than explosions. Her friend finally leaned slightly toward her brother, whispering something I couldn't hear. He gave a faint nod, acknowledging her concern without speaking aloud. Meanwhile, my sister continued her subtle dance of control, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the silent observation I was maintaining. By the time our coffees were half finished, the tension remained, but I felt a growing sense of clarity. I was no longer caught entirely in the storm she created. I could observe, respond thoughtfully, and maintain my composure. The day was far from over, and the sparks were still flickering, but I understood how to navigate them without letting them dictate my mood or actions. By mid-afternoon, the cafe had thinned, leaving only a few scattered patrons. The soft hum of conversation and the clatter of cups created a background that felt almost deceptive, masking the tension at our table. My sister leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on me with a quiet intensity. "Why are you always like this?" she asked suddenly, voice lower but sharper than before. The casual rhythm of her speech had shifted. There was a pointedness now, a precision that cut through the polite silence we had maintained. I met her gaze calmly, inhaling slowly before replying. "Like what?" I asked, deliberately neutral, my voice steady. I wanted to acknowledge her without giving her words power to provoke me further. Like you don't care. Like you're always going to make things difficult for everyone." Her hands gestured slightly, not wildly, but with enough movement to emphasize her frustration. I paused, considering my response carefully. I could feel her friend stiffen, glance quickly at her brother, who, in turn, sat motionless, observing every word and gesture. This was the moment of testing the point where the subtle sparks from earlier could ignite into open conflict. "I'm not trying to make things difficult," I said slowly. "I just can't do everything for everyone. Sometimes you have to do things yourself." My tone was calm, measured, firm without aggression, her eyebrows knitted together. There was a brief flash of disbelief in her eyes, as if she couldn't reconcile my calmness with her expectation of drama. "You always think you're right, don't you?" she muttered, almost under her breath. I realized that her frustration wasn't just about coffee or snacks anymore. It was about control, about dominance, about testing boundaries. I chose to let the statement hang in the air without comment. The silence became another weapon, another layer of tension, stretching across the table. Her friend finally spoke, softly, almost hesitantly. "Maybe we should just relax? It's just coffee after all." Her voice was careful, as if placing a suggestion in the middle of the table without directing it at anyone in particular. Her brother gave a faint nod, still silent, but clearly acknowledging the delicate balance. My sister, however, didn't respond. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and gave a small, tight-lipped laugh that was half amusement, half exasperation. I realized then that this was a turning point. She wanted a reaction, a spark of irritation, an argument, a concession. And yet, here I was, refusing to provide the fuel for escalation. My composure, quiet and deliberate, became a mirror, reflecting her frustration back without distortion. Then came a small but sharp gesture. She flicked her hand toward the bag of pastries between us, as if challenging me to reach for it or acknowledge her control. I didn't flinch. I let the gesture pass, silent and unreactive. The cafe, once innocuous, now felt like an arena, every sound amplified, every glance meaningful. Her friend shifted again, this time clearly uncomfortable, whispering something I couldn't hear. Her brother leaned forward slightly, as if ready to intervene, but restrained by observation. The tension had reached a subtle peak, not explosive, but heavy enough to press down on the shoulders of everyone at the table. I took another sip of coffee, slow and deliberate, grounding myself in the act. I realized that the battle wasn't about coffee, pastries, or even words. It was about patience, control, and silent assertion. I could either let the tension define me or observe it, navigate it, and maintain my own sense of self. For several minutes, the room existed in this suspended state, gestures, glances, half smiles, silent judgments. The outside world moved obliviously around us. But within our small circle, every motion, every glance carried weight. Finally, my sister leaned back, exhaling sharply, as if releasing the pressure she had been building. "Fine," she said, almost casually. "I guess we can just enjoy the coffee." The edge in her voice remained, but it was a small concession, a temporary retreat from confrontation. Her friend smiled faintly, relieved. Her brother adjusted his posture, still silent, still observing. And I quietly allowed myself a small sense of accomplishment. The tension hadn't disappeared, it hadn't been resolved, but I had maintained composure, navigated the provocation, and emerged intact. As we stepped out of the cafe, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. The day had been a delicate balancing act, each conversation, glance, and gesture a tightrope walk between assertion and conflict. My sister walked ahead, confident, arms swinging lightly, as if nothing had occurred. Her friend and her brother followed, still cautious, their expressions measured. I lingered slightly behind, absorbing the subtle echoes of tension that remained in the air. The walk back to the car was quiet. Not the comfortable silence of a group at ease, but the heavy, layered silence of unresolved friction. My sister occasionally glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, perhaps satisfied, perhaps still simmering. Her friend walked close beside her, cautious but polite, while her brother's calm demeanor belied the quiet attention he had maintained throughout the encounter. I reflected on the day. Coffee, pastries, and a casual outing, mundane on the surface, but the afternoon had revealed layers of control, subtle power plays, and the challenges of navigating family dynamics. Each small spark of tension, each test of patience, had required careful observation, deliberate restraint, and a clear sense of boundaries. When we reached the car, my sister opened the door without a word. I slid in, closing it behind me, feeling the residual weight of the interaction still pressing lightly on my shoulders. Her friend and her brother settled into the seats with quiet efficiency. Their earlier discomfort softened but still lingering. The drive home was subdued. The faint hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of traffic were the only sounds. I focused inward, letting the quiet give space for reflection. I thought about the subtle gestures, her smirks, the flick of her hand, the measured tone of her voice. They were minor in isolation, but in context, they revealed patterns of expectation, control, and challenge. Her friend finally spoke, quietly, as if testing the water. "It's good. We're all here, I guess." Coffee was nice. Her words were soft, cautious, and carefully neutral. Her brother nodded slightly, agreeing without comment. My sister remained silent, eyes forward, perhaps reflecting, perhaps planning her next subtle maneuver. I let her words drift, choosing not to engage in overanalysis or explanation. I had maintained my boundaries, navigated provocations, and asserted my presence without escalation. That alone felt like a victory, quiet, unspoken, and profoundly grounding. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The afternoon had been mentally taxing, filled with small but potent tests of patience, composure, and observation. Yet it had also provided insight. Family interactions, especially with someone like my sister, were rarely straightforward. They were a series of negotiations, subtle power plays, and unspoken expectations, requiring awareness, careful navigation, and a strong sense of self. As I stepped out of the car and closed the door, I realized something important. The day hadn't ended in confrontation or drama, but it hadn't ended in harmony either. It had ended in quiet understanding and acknowledgement that boundaries, patience, and self-possession were as essential in everyday encounters as they were in larger conflicts. I looked back at my sister, her friend, and her brother, each carrying their own reflections, silent narratives, and judgments. And I understood with clarity that these ordinary moments were also extraordinary lessons, moments that revealed the subtle art of navigating relationships, asserting independence, and maintaining composure in the face of provocation. And though the tension lingered, faint and persistent like a shadow, I felt stronger, steadier, and more prepared. For in the quiet aftermath of these encounters, I had discovered the resilience to stand my ground, observe without judgment, and navigate the complex dance of family and social dynamics on my own terms. The following weekend brought an unexpected invitation from my sister, a casual dinner at a trendy downtown restaurant with her friend and her brother. On the surface, it sounded simple: food, laughter, an evening out. But experience had taught me that simple was rarely simple with her. As I got ready, I felt a mix of anticipation and caution. The memory of the park, the cafe, and the subtle sparks of tension still lingered. I reminded myself to stay calm, observant, and assertive, ready for any test she might present. When I arrived, they were already seated at a table near the window. The restaurant buzzed with activity, low lighting creating an intimate atmosphere. My sister's posture was confident, a slight smirk on her lips. Her friend waved nervously, while her brother gave a nod of acknowledgement. Finally, my sister said, half teasing, half impatient, "I thought you'd chicken out." Her words were playful in tone but carried that familiar edge of control. I offered a small smile, carefully neutral. "Traffic was crazy," I replied lightly, settling into my seat. From the moment I sat down, I observed. Every gesture, every glance, every sip of water became part of a subtle power dance: who moves first, who speaks, how authority is expressed without words. And as dinner began, I noticed the invisible tension threading its way through the conversation. Thick yet delicate, demanding navigation, the appetizers arrived, and my sister immediately reached across the table, picking up a small plate. Her friend hesitated, watching her closely, while her brother remained still, quietly monitoring interactions. "You always do this," my sister said softly, half laughing, half critical, taking forever to pick something. "Why is it so hard?" I met her gaze evenly, taking a measured bite of my salad. "I just like to think before deciding," I said calmly. No apology, no tension, just a statement of personal choice. Her smirk faltered slightly. "Hey, she muttered, shaking her head, a small but clear display of frustration. Her friend fidgeted with her napkin, unsure how to respond, and her brother maintained his quiet, observant demeanor. The tension continued, subtle yet persistent. Every joke, every comment seemed loaded, a test of patience, composure, and boundaries. I realized again that the evening wasn't about dinner, it was about navigating control, asserting independence, and surviving the invisible challenges she created. Halfway through dinner, the subtle tension escalated. My sister leaned forward, voice calm but edged with provocation. "You really think you can just sit there and not react? Not even a little?" Her friend glanced nervously at her brother, who remained stoic, silent, a steady anchor amidst the brewing storm. I paused, considering my response carefully. This was the moment of testing the peak of the subtle conflict that had threaded through the day. "I'm not reacting because there's nothing to react to," I said quietly, deliberately measured. "I'm here to enjoy dinner, not to argue over small things." Her eyes narrowed, a brief flash of disbelief crossing her face. The finger gesture incident, the park, and the calf all seemed to coalesce into this single moment, a silent challenge, a subtle demand for concession. I remained calm, letting the silence do the work. Minutes passed in a quiet standoff, each of us aware of the other's presence, choices, and unspoken expectations. Her friend finally let out a nervous laugh, the tension momentarily easing, while her brother subtly adjusted his posture, providing silent support through observation. By the time dessert arrived, the sharp edges of tension had dulled. My sister leaned back, exhaling, her smirk softer, more playful. "Fine," she said lightly. "We can just eat and enjoy the evening." Her friend relaxed, offering a small smile, while her brother remained quietly observant, satisfied that the storm had passed without incident. I realized that even though nothing had been explicitly resolved, maintaining composure and asserting personal boundaries had allowed the evening to continue without escalation. As we left the restaurant, the night air felt lighter. The tension from earlier weeks had not disappeared, but it had been tempered. I walked slightly ahead, reflecting on the evening's lessons: patience, observation, composure, and the quiet strength required to navigate family dynamics and social challenges. Sometimes, I thought, the victories aren't loud or dramatic, they are subtle, unspoken, and internal. And tonight, I had won in ways that mattered most, by holding my ground, observing carefully, and refusing to allow others' expectations to dictate my actions. The weekend arrived with a quiet tension lingering in my chest. My sister had suggested a small gathering at her apartment, just the three of them and me. But after all the previous outings, I knew, just a small gathering often carried hidden tests. As I walked up the stairs to her apartment, I felt my heart beat faster, not from fear, but anticipation. I knew the subtle challenges, the provocation hidden in casual words, could appear at any moment. The door opened, and she greeted me with that familiar smirk, while her friend and brother were already inside, quietly arranging themselves in their usual positions. Friend nervous, brother watchful. Finally, my sister said lightly, voice carrying playful authority. "Hope you're ready for tonight." I smiled faintly, setting my bag down and reminding myself to remain calm, observant, and patient. Dinner began, small talk carefully measured. But tension escalated as my sister casually asked me to handle tasks she could easily do herself: pouring drinks, passing plates, arranging cutlery. I realized this was no accident. It was a test, similar to the fries or coffee incidents. "I think you should just get it," I said calmly, refusing to comply automatically. "You can handle it yourself." My voice was soft but firm, steady, her eyebrows raised, and for a split second, I saw disbelief and irritation flash across her face. Her friend fidgeted nervously, while her brother's gaze sharpened, watching, evaluating, waiting. You really can't just help for once? She asked, almost incredulously. The words weren't loud, but the weight behind them was palpable. I held my ground. I'm here to enjoy the evening, not to do everything for you, I replied quietly, deliberate, unflinching. The room fell into silence, thick and charged. The subtle tension reached its peak when my sister gestured sharply, frustration now clear in her posture. I can't believe you keep doing this, she said, voice low but firm. Everyone's here to have fun, and you, she gestured vaguely at me, just resist everything. Her friend shifted uneasily, glancing at her brother, who remained composed but alert. I realized this was the moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of weeks of testing, provocation, and boundary pushing. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm not resisting you, I said calmly. I'm respecting myself. I can enjoy being here without giving in to every expectation or demand. For a moment, the room was suspended in silence. Then her smirk softened, a fleeting acknowledgement passing through her expression. Her friend relaxed slightly, and her brother's subtle nod confirmed what I already knew. I had held my ground. After dessert, my sister finally leaned back, exhaling with a faint laugh. Fine, she said. Maybe I pushed too hard sometimes. Her words were not a full apology, but the tone carried concession, an acknowledgement of the boundaries I had asserted. Her friend smiled gently, relieved. Her brother remained quietly observant, and I allowed myself a small, inward sigh of relief. The tension had not disappeared completely, but the balance had shifted. I had maintained composure, defended my boundaries, and navigated the subtle social pressures without losing myself. As I left her apartment that night, walking under the cool streetlights, I reflected on the journey. Weeks of small tests, subtle provocations, and tense outings had taught me patience, observation, and resilience. The victories were not dramatic or loud, they were quiet, internal, and profoundly meaningful. Family dynamics, I realized, were rarely simple. They required awareness, strength, and the courage to assert oneself while maintaining connection. And sometimes the most important triumphs are the ones that are unspoken, invisible to the world, but deeply felt within. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly grounded, aware that I could navigate conflict, maintain my self-respect, and survive the subtle storms that arise when love, expectations, and personality collide.